England, 1847. The autumn rain beat against the windows of the modest Harrington estate as Lady Caroline stood before the mirror, her slender fingers trembling as they smoothed the ivory silk of her wedding gown. At 23, she had long resigned herself to spinsterhood, accustomed to being overlooked in London's glittering ballrooms in favour of prettier, wealthier debutantes. The bedroom door opened softly, and Caroline caught her mother's reflection in the mirror. Lady Eleanor Harrington entered, carrying a small wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. "You look beautiful, my dear," her mother whispered, her eyes glistening with tears as she opened the box to reveal the family's heirloom pearl hairpins. "Thank you, Mother," Caroline replied, her voice barely audible above the rainfall, "though I fear beauty has never been counted among my virtues." "Nonsense," Lady Eleanor chided gently as she began securing the pearls into Caroline's chestnut waves. "True beauty comes from within. You possess a gentle spirit and a keen mind, qualities far more enduring than mere physical charms." Caroline studied her reflection, her soft hazel eyes, her delicate features that had never turned heads, her modest figure draped in the finest dress her family could afford. In truth, she was not unattractive, merely unremarkable in a society that prized exceptional beauty. "Do you truly believe this union will bring happiness, Mother?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. Lady Eleanor's hands paused. In truth, she had harbored dreams that her only daughter would find a love match as she herself had. But with the family's dwindling fortunes and Caroline's advancing age, the proposal from the illustrious Duke of Ashworth had seemed nothing short of miraculous. "The Duke is a respectable man of considerable standing," Eleanor replied carefully. "Such an advantageous match is more than many could hope for." "You haven't answered my question," Caroline observed, turning to face her mother directly. Eleanor sighed, taking her daughter's hands in her own. "Happiness takes many forms, my darling. Security, respect, position, these are not insignificant foundations upon which contentment may be built. And who knows what may grow from such beginnings?" What remained unspoken was the desperate relief that had washed over the Harrington household when Henry Ashworth, the 30-year-old Duke, had agreed to the marriage. His estates were vast, his bloodline impeccable, his reputation formidable. That he had chosen their daughter had been shocking, a blessing they dared not question too closely. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Caroline's father, Sir James Harrington, entered, his once imposing frame now slightly stooped with age and financial worry. "The carriage is prepared," he announced, his voice carrying forced cheerfulness. His eyes softened as he beheld his daughter in her bridal attire. "My dear girl, you are a vision." Caroline crossed the room to embrace him, inhaling the familiar scent of tobacco and cologne. "Thank you, Father." "The Duke is a fortunate man," Sir James continued, his voice rough with emotion, "though I doubt he realizes quite how fortunate." "We must not keep him waiting," Lady Eleanor reminded them, carefully adjusting Caroline's veil. "It would not do to be late to one's own wedding." The journey to the family chapel passed in silence, the rhythmic drumming of rain on the carriage roof matching the anxious beating of Caroline's heart. Through the window she watched the familiar countryside blur into watercolor impressions of green and grey. By sunset, she would be mistress of an estate she had never seen, wife to a man she barely knew. Hours later, standing in the hushed grandeur of the family chapel, Caroline felt a strange detachment as she repeated her vows. The Duke towered beside her, his sharp profile etched against the stained glass like a figure carved from stone. His voice, deep and authoritative, betrayed no emotion as he pledged himself to her. "I, Henry George William Ashworth, take thee, Caroline Elizabeth Harrington, to be my lawfully wedded wife." When their hands touched during the exchange of rings, she noticed how cold his fingers were against hers. The assembled guests, mostly his acquaintances, his side of the church, filled with England's most distinguished families, watched with polite interest, evaluating her worth with calculating eyes. "You may kiss the bride," the vicar announced, his voice echoing against the ancient stone walls. The Duke leaned forward, pressing his lips briefly, formally against hers, a perfunctory seal to their contract, nothing more. Caroline closed her eyes, trying to imagine that this cold touch held some promise of future warmth, but the moment ended before she could convince herself of the fantasy. The wedding breakfast that followed was an elegant but subdued affair. Caroline found herself seated beside her new husband at the head table, acutely aware of how little they had spoken, beyond the necessary exchanges of the ceremony. "You have a lovely home, Lady Harrington," the Duke commented to her mother, his tone polite but distant. "The gardens, in particular, show remarkable care." "Caroline is responsible for those," Lady Eleanor replied with subtle pride. "She has quite a talent for horticulture." The Duke's gaze shifted to Caroline, seeming to truly look at her for the first time. "Indeed, an unusual interest for a young lady." "I find peace among growing things," Caroline answered, seizing the opportunity to establish some connection, however tenuous. "There is something miraculous in nurturing life from seed to bloom." A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, perhaps interest, crossed his features before his expression resumed its customary reserve. "Oakenhurst has extensive gardens, though I fear they've suffered from neglect in recent years. Perhaps you will find them a worthy challenge." "I should like that very much," Caroline replied, offering a tentative smile that went unreturned as the Duke turned to acknowledge a congratulatory toast from a neighboring landowner. As the afternoon progressed, Caroline observed her husband from beneath lowered lashes. Henry Ashworth was undeniably handsome, tall and broad-shouldered, with the strong jawline and aristocratic bearing that generations of noble breeding had perfected. His dark hair, swept back from a high forehead, was just beginning to silver at the temples, lending him an air of distinguished maturity. Yet it was his eyes that most captivated and unnerved her. Steel grey, intelligent, but curiously cold, as though viewing the world through a protective layer of ice. When the time came for their departure, Caroline bid her parents farewell with carefully controlled emotion. Lady Eleanor embraced her tightly, whispering, "Write to me, my darling. And remember, patience often reaps the sweetest rewards." Sir James kissed her forehead, his voice too choked for words, before shaking the Duke's hand with all the dignity he could muster. "Take care of her, Your Grace. She is our greatest treasure." "You have my word, Sir James," the Duke replied formally. Oakenhurst Abbey, the Duke's ancestral estate, loomed like a fortress against the darkening sky as their carriage approached that evening. Caroline gazed through the window at the imposing Gothic architecture, its towers and turrets silhouetted against the twilight, gardens stretching into the distance like a sea of shadow. "Your new home," the Duke stated simply, breaking the silence that had persisted throughout their journey. It was not said with pride or warmth, merely a statement of fact. "It's magnificent," Caroline murmured, genuinely awed by the scale and grandeur of the estate. "It has stood for 4 centuries, he replied. "The east wing dates from Tudor times, though most of what you see was rebuilt during my great-grandfather's tenure." The carriage passed through elaborate wrought-iron gates and proceeded up a winding drive lined with ancient oak trees. As they drew closer, Caroline could make out more details: the intricate stonework, the countless windows gleaming like stars in the gathering dusk, the sweeping steps leading to massive oak doors. Inside, Caroline was overwhelmed by the grandeur: marble floors, ornate tapestries, priceless artwork, and a household staff that lined up to greet their new mistress with curious eyes. The Duke's housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, a stern-faced woman with silver-streaked hair pulled tightly beneath her cap, stepped forward with a formal curtsy. "Welcome to Oakenhurst Abbey, Your Grace," she addressed Caroline, the title still unfamiliar to her ears. "Thank you, Mrs. Winters," Caroline replied, striving to project a confidence she did not feel. "I look forward to becoming acquainted with the household. The staff has been instructed to assist you in every way as you settle into your role," the Duke stated, his tone making it clear that he expected her to manage domestic matters without troubling him. "Mrs. Winters has served Oakenhurst for 20 years and will guide you through the particular customs of the estate." Mrs. Winters led them through corridors that seemed endless, offering a brief history of the Abbey's more notable features: the medieval cloisters incorporated into the north wing, the portrait gallery featuring Ashworth ancestors dating back to the reign of Henry VII, the grand ballroom that had hosted 3 different monarchs over the centuries. "Your chambers have been prepared, Your Grace," Mrs. Winters finally informed her, stopping before an ornately carved door. Caroline had expected to share quarters with her husband, as her parents always had. The revelation that she would occupy a separate suite sent a chill through her heart, but she maintained her composure, thanking the housekeeper with the quiet dignity her mother had instilled in her. "I trust you will find everything to your satisfaction," Mrs. Winters continued, opening the door to reveal a sumptuous apartment decorated in shades of blue and silver. Your lady's maid Jane has already unpacked your belongings. If there is anything else you require, you need only ring. Thank you, Caroline said, taking in the elegant four-poster bed, the marble fireplace already crackling with a welcoming blaze, the sitting area with delicate furniture that appeared rarely used. I shall leave you to rest, the Duke announced from the doorway. The journey has been long and you must be fatigued. We will dine at 8 if you feel equal to it. Otherwise, a tray can be sent up. I should prefer to join you for dinner, Caroline replied, determined to begin as she meant to continue, as a proper wife and duchess, not an invalid to be corseted and forgotten. Very well. Mrs. Winters will send your maid to assist you at 7:30. With a curt nod, he departed, leaving Caroline alone in her new chambers, the enormity of her changed circumstances crashing over her like a wave. Jane, her newly assigned lady's maid, proved to be a blessing. A cheerful, efficient young woman with quick hands and a kind smile. As she helped Caroline change into an evening gown of deep emerald silk, one of the new dresses her parents had commissioned for her trousseau at considerable expense, she offered discreet information about Oakenhurst and its master. The Duke keeps regular hours, Your Grace, Jane explained, as she arranged Caroline's hair in an elegant knot. Breakfast is served in the morning room from 7 until 9, though His Grace typically takes his at 7:30, precisely before attending to estate matters. Luncheon is at 1, dinner at 8. The Duke prefers punctuality above all things. And what of the Duke's family? Caroline inquired, hoping to glean some insight into the man she had married. Are there relatives who visit frequently? Only Lady Sophia Pembroke, the Duke's sister, Jane replied as she secured a pearl comb in Caroline's hair. She was unable to attend the wedding due to her mourning period. Her husband passed 6 months ago. She resides primarily in London but visits several times a year. At precisely 8 o'clock, Caroline descended the grand staircase, her heart pounding as she approached the dining room where a footman waited to announce her. The vast chamber, illuminated by a crystal chandelier and dozens of candles, seemed excessive for just 2 diners. The Duke already stood at the head of a table that could easily seat 30 guests. Your Grace, the footman intoned, the Duchess of Ashworth. Henry looked up, his expression inscrutable as he watched Caroline's approach. You look well, he observed, the closest thing to a compliment he had offered since their meeting. Thank you, she replied, taking her place at the opposite end of the table, a distance that made conversation nearly impossible without raising one's voice. The meal progressed with excruciating formality, multiple courses served by silent footmen, the clink of silver on fine china echoing in the cavernous room. Caroline attempted conversation several times, inquiring about the estate, the neighbouring families, the history of Oakenhurst, but received only perfunctory replies that discouraged further questions. After dinner, they withdrew to a smaller sitting room where coffee was served. Caroline noticed that while the room was beautifully appointed, it had the unlived-in quality of a museum display, perfect but soulless. Do you play? The Duke asked suddenly, gesturing toward the pianoforte in the corner. A little, Caroline admitted, though I fear I lack any exceptional talent. My mother was an accomplished musician, he said, a distant look in his eyes. This was her favourite room. It was the first personal information he had volunteered, and Caroline seized upon it eagerly. When did she pass away? When I was 12. My father followed 3 years later. His tone made it clear the subject was closed. They lapsed into silence once more, the ticking of the mantel clock marking the slow passage of time. At 10:30, the Duke rose. I have correspondence to attend to, he announced. Please do not feel obliged to wait up. I imagine you must be tired after the day's events. Yes, of course, Caroline replied, disappointment washing over her, despite her determination to remain positive. Good night, Your Grace. He hesitated, as though about to say something more, then merely inclined his head before departing, leaving Caroline alone with her thoughts and the dying fire. Later that evening, having changed into her finest nightgown with the help of Jane, Caroline sat at her dressing table, brushing her hair with methodical strokes. She had dismissed the maid, preferring solitude as she prepared for what she assumed would be her husband's arrival. Her mother had explained with delicate circumspection what would be expected on her wedding night. While the conversation had left Caroline nervous and uncertain, She was determined to fulfill her duties as a wife with the same grace and dignity she approached all responsibilities. The knock at her door came just as the mantel clock struck 11. The Duke entered without waiting for her response. He had removed his formal attire and wore a dark smoking jacket, his expression inscrutable as he regarded her. Caroline rose, her heart fluttering with nervous anticipation. Despite everything, a small part of her had nurtured hope, perhaps not for passionate love, but for kindness, for companionship, for the chance that affection might grow between them. "My lord," she said softly, approaching him with hesitant steps. Henry Ashworth studied her with detached assessment. "I trust you find your accommodations satisfactory?" "Yes, thank you. The rooms are lovely. And the staff has been attentive to your needs." "Very much so. Everyone has been most helpful." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Caroline, gathering her courage, moved closer, thinking that perhaps he was as uncertain as she. When she was near enough to catch the faint scent of his cologne, she tilted her face upward, waiting for her husband's kiss. Instead, the Duke took a deliberate step backward. His grey eyes, cold as the North Sea in winter, met hers with unflinching directness. "I feel no love, no desire for you," he stated, his tone as matter-of-fact as if discussing the weather. "This is an arrangement, nothing more. I require an heir and a mistress for my household. You will fulfill these duties, and in return you shall want for nothing material." Each word struck Caroline like a physical blow. The blood drained from her face as she struggled to maintain her composure, to not reveal how deeply his callous honesty wounded her. "I understand," she managed, though her voice trembled. "I do not wish to be cruel," he continued, his expression softening fractionally at her evident distress. "Merely clear. False expectations lead only to unnecessary pain. It is better that we understand each other from the beginning." "Yes," Caroline whispered, clasping her hands tightly to prevent them from shaking. "I appreciate your honesty." "Good," he nodded curtly. "I shall not disturb your rest tonight. We will discuss household matters in the morning. Mrs. Winters will provide you with the account books and staff schedules after breakfast." With that, he turned and left, closing the door firmly behind him. The moment he was gone, Caroline's knees gave way. She sank to the floor, silent tears streaming down her cheeks as the full weight of her new reality descended upon her. She had expected perhaps indifference, even coldness, but not such brutal honesty, not such complete rejection. She thought of her parents, of how her father's eyes had crinkled when he smiled at her mother across the breakfast table, of the way her mother had always known when he entered a room without turning to look. She thought of the quiet tenderness they shared, the small everyday intimacies that had made their home warm, despite their financial struggles. Would she ever know such comfort? Or was she destined to wander the cold grand halls of Oakenhurst Abbey, a duchess in name, but a stranger to her husband's heart? In the vast, unfamiliar bed later that night, surrounded by luxury but utterly alone, Caroline stared at the ornate canopy above her and allowed herself one night of despair, one night to mourn the dreams she had secretly harbored, despite her practical nature. "I was a fool," she whispered into the darkness. "A fool to hope for more than this arrangement." Yet even as the thought formed, another voice, her mother's voice, seemed to answer, "Patience, my darling. The coldest winters eventually yield to spring." Come morning, she vowed, she would face her new life with dignity. She would be the best Duchess of Ashworth she could be, managing the household with efficiency, representing her husband with grace in public, fulfilling every duty expected of her. But tonight in the darkness, she whispered her deepest fear into her tear-dampened pillow. "Will I ever know what it is to be truly loved?" Outside her windows, the autumn rain continued to fall, washing away the last vestiges of the life she had known, leaving only uncertainty and the faint, fragile hope that somewhere beneath the Duke's icy exterior beat a heart capable of thawing. The winter months at Oakenhurst Abbey passed with glacial slowness. Caroline adapted to her role as Duchess with quiet determination, learning the intricacies of managing the vast estate, memorizing the names and positions of every servant, and gradually making subtle improvements to the household that had lacked a mistress for too long. Her days fell into a predictable pattern. Mornings were spent reviewing household accounts with Mrs. Winters, who had gradually warmed to Caroline's efficient, respectful management style. Afternoons often found her in the estate's magnificent but neglected conservatory, restoring exotic plants, that had withered under insufficient care. "These orchids can be saved," she told Mr. Simmons, the elderly head gardener, as they surveyed the space together. "With proper attention, they'll bloom again by spring." "It's been years since anyone truly cared for them, Your Grace," he replied, a note of hope in his voice. "The late Duchess had quite the passion for rare specimens." Caroline nodded, gently touching a withered leaf. "Then we shall honor her memory by restoring them." The Duke remained an elusive figure, often absent on business in London or closeted in his study when in residence. Their interactions were formal, limited to necessary discussions about household matters, or brief appearances together at local functions where propriety demanded the presence of both Duke and Duchess. On a particularly bitter January morning, Caroline was summoned to the Duke's study, an unusual occurrence that caused a flutter of apprehension in her chest. "You wish to see me, my lord?" she inquired, standing before his imposing mahogany desk. Henry looked up from his correspondence, his expression guarded as always. "Yes, my sister, Lady Sophia Pembroke, has written to announce her intention to visit next week. She is recently widowed and seeks a change of scenery." Caroline nodded, already mentally reviewing the preparations necessary for an extended guest. "I shall ensure everything is arranged for her comfort." "There is something else you should know," Henry continued, his tone revealing a rare hesitation. "Sophia and I were raised primarily by our grandmother after our parents' deaths. She is protective of me and may not immediately welcome your presence." "I understand," Caroline replied, though inwardly she wondered at the complexity of family dynamics she had yet to unravel. "Is there anything specific I might do to make her feel at ease?" A flicker of surprise crossed the Duke's features, as though he had expected a different reaction. "Simply be yourself, I suppose. Sophia appreciates honesty, if nothing else." 3 days later, Lady Sophia Pembroke arrived in a flurry of black silk and piercing observations. At 32, she retained the striking Ashworth features, the same steel-grey eyes as her brother, though hers flashed with emotion where his remained coldly controlled. "So this is the bride," Sophia remarked during their first dinner together, her assessing gaze travelling over Caroline. "Henry's letters mentioned you were managing Oakenhurst competently, but he failed to note your youth. I assure you, Lady Pembroke, I take my responsibilities quite seriously," Caroline replied evenly. "Indeed, and which responsibilities might those be?" Sophia's arched eyebrow conveyed volumes. Henry cleared his throat. "Caroline has made considerable improvements to the household, Sophia. The East Wing is finally habitable again, and the accounts are in better order than they've been in years." "How delightful to have married an efficient housekeeper," Sophia commented dryly, but Caroline caught the thoughtful look she cast toward her brother. Later that evening, unable to sleep, Caroline wandered to the library, seeking solace in books as had been her habit since childhood. To her surprise, she found Sophia already there, examining the shelves with a glass of brandy in hand. A shocking liberty for a lady, but one that somehow suited her independent air. "My apologies, Lady Pembroke. I didn't mean to intrude," Caroline said, preparing to withdraw. "Stay," Sophia commanded, turning to face her. "And for heaven's sake, call me Sophia. Lady Pembroke reminds me too much of my late husband, who was, I assure you, not worth remembering." Cautiously, Caroline entered the room. "I'm sorry for your loss nonetheless." Sophia laughed without humour. "Are you?" "Don't be. It was a marriage of convenience that brought me neither happiness nor particular distress. Much like yours, I imagine." The blunt assessment startled Caroline. Please, spare me the polite fiction." Sophia waved her hand dismissively. "I know my brother. He is many things, but a loving husband is not among them, not since Elizabeth." "Elizabeth?" The name slipped from Caroline's lips before she could stop herself. Sophia's eyes widened. "He hasn't told you, has he? Fascinating." She settled into a leather armchair, gesturing for Caroline to take the one opposite. "You ought to know, I suppose, if you're to make any sense of the man you've married." And so, as the fire crackled in the grate, Sophia revealed the history that had shaped the Duke of Ashworth. Elizabeth Carlyle had been Henry's first love, a vibrant, beautiful girl from a neighbouring estate. Their courtship had progressed nearly to engagement when she had fallen ill with scarlet fever, dying merely days before Henry planned to propose. "He was but 21, Sophia explained, her voice softening with the memory. "After Elizabeth, he threw himself into estate management, into politics, into anything that required no emotional investment. I had hoped time would heal him, but she studied Caroline with newfound interest. Tell me, what made you agree to marry my brother? Surely a girl like you could have found a match with at least the pretense of affection. Caroline's hands twisted in her lap. My family's circumstances were difficult, and She paused, the truth rising unbidden to her lips. I had never been the sort of girl who attracted suitors. I was invisible in ballrooms, overlooked at dinner parties. When the Duke expressed interest, it seemed miraculous. Invisible, Sophia repeated thoughtfully. How interesting. Henry has spent a decade making himself invulnerable, and they matched him with a woman who has spent her life being unseen. She set down her empty glass. Perhaps there is wisdom in that I cannot yet perceive. The following weeks brought an unexpected shift to Oakenhurst. Sophia, rather than departing after a customary week's visit, announced her intention to stay through spring. Her presence acted as a catalyst, forcing interaction where there had been distance. She insisted on daily rides, on musical evenings, on dining together, rather than allowing Henry to take meals in his study. During one such ride, Caroline, Henry, and Sophia stopped to rest their horses near a stream on the estate's edge. As Sophia wandered ahead to gather early wildflowers, Caroline found herself momentarily alone with her husband. Your sister has brought much life to Oakenhurst, she observed cautiously. Henry's gaze followed Sophia's distant figure. She has always been the heart of our family. I sometimes wonder if she shouldn't have been born the heir instead of me. You manage the estate admirably, Caroline offered. Managing is not the same as living, though, is it? He replied, a rare moment of vulnerability that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Before Caroline could respond, he straightened in his saddle. We should return. The weather looks to turn. That evening, a violent storm lashed the abbey. As lightning illuminated her bedroom in stark flashes, Caroline heard a crash from the conservatory below. Concerned for the rare plants she had painstakingly nursed back to health, she hurried downstairs, lamp in hand. The scene that greeted her was one of devastation. A fallen tree branch had shattered one of the glass panels, allowing rain and wind to wreak havoc on the delicate specimens within. Without hesitation, Caroline set to work, gathering the most vulnerable plants and moving them to safety. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't notice the Duke's arrival until his voice cut through the howling wind. What in heaven's name are you doing? Caroline looked up, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance, her nightgown and robe sodden, her hair falling loose down her back. Saving what can be saved, she answered simply, continuing her work. To her astonishment, Henry removed his dressing gown and rolled up his shirt sleeves. Tell me what needs to be done. Side by side they worked, securing the broken panel with a temporary barricade, rescuing plants, mopping standing water. When the immediate crisis had passed, they stood amid the dripping foliage, breathing heavily from their exertions. I didn't realize you cared so deeply for these plants, Henry said, observing her with new awareness. They're living things, Caroline replied. Neglected, perhaps, but still capable of recovery with proper attention. She met his gaze steadily, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them. You're shivering, he noted, and in a gesture that surprised them both, he draped his dressing gown around her shoulders. Come, you must change into dry clothes before you fall ill. As they walked back through the darkened house, Caroline was acutely conscious of his hand at the small of her back, guiding her, the first gentle touch he had offered since their wedding day. At her chamber door, he paused. Thank you, he said stiffly, for caring for Oakenhurst as though it were your own. It is my home now, she answered simply. Good night, Henry. It was the first time she had used his given name. As she closed her door, Caroline didn't see the Duke remain standing in the corridor, a conflicted expression on his face, or know that he would walk the halls for hours that night, haunted by memories and by new, unsettling possibilities. The following days revealed subtle shifts in their relationship. Henry began appearing in the conservatory during Caroline's afternoon work there, ostensibly to check on the repairs, but lingering to ask questions about particular plants or listen to her plans for the space. My mother was fond of orchids as well, he remarked one afternoon, watching as Caroline carefully repotted a damaged specimen. She claimed they represented the perfect balance of strength and delicacy. A wise observation, Caroline replied, pleased by this voluntary sharing of a memory. They're remarkably resilient despite their fragile appearance. Like certain people, perhaps, Henry said, his gaze resting on her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. The arrival of a letter from Caroline's parents created another unexpected connection. Her father's health had been declining, and her mother's words carried thinly veiled concern beneath their cheerful surface. "Is everything well?" Henry inquired, noticing her troubled expression at the breakfast table. Caroline hesitated, then confided her worries. To her surprise, Henry listened attentively, then made a suggestion. "Perhaps they might visit when the weather improves," he offered. "The country air could benefit your father's health." "You wouldn't mind?" Caroline asked, touched by the unexpected consideration. "They are family now," he replied simply. As March advanced, bringing the first hints of spring to the estate, Caroline noticed other small changes. Henry taking more meals with her, occasionally joining her for walks in the gardens, even once requesting her opinion on plans for improving tenant cottages on the northern boundary. "You have a practical mind," he commented, when she suggested modifications that would increase comfort while reducing costs. "I value that." Coming from the reserved Duke, such words constituted high praise indeed. Caroline treasured these moments, these glimpses of the man beneath the formal exterior, even as she cautioned herself against reading too much into them. One evening, as they sat in the drawing room with Sophia, the conversation turned to music. At her sister-in-law's urging, Caroline played several pieces on the pianoforte, including a Beethoven sonata that had been a favorite of her father's. "You play with genuine feeling," Henry remarked afterward, surprising her with the compliment. "Thank you," Caroline replied, her cheeks warming. "Music has always been a solace." "Henry used to play quite brilliantly," Sophia interjected. "Perhaps you might persuade him to join you in a duet sometime." "I no longer play," Henry said curtly, his expression closing. An uncomfortable silence fell, and Caroline, sensing his discomfort, deftly changed the subject. Later, when Henry had excused himself to attend to correspondence, Sophia approached Caroline at the pianoforte. "It was Elizabeth's favorite instrument," she explained quietly. "They often played duets together. He hasn't touched a keyboard since her death." "I see," Caroline murmured, understanding better now the complexity of wounds she navigated. "But he listened to you play," Sophia observed, "for the full hour, without distraction. A month ago he would have found an excuse to leave after the first movement." She squeezed Caroline's hand. "Small steps, my dear. The heart doesn't heal overnight, especially one that's been frozen for so long." In early April, a letter arrived from London that caused Henry's face to darken with concern. Though he said nothing at breakfast, Caroline noticed his distraction, the tension in his shoulders as he excused himself abruptly. That afternoon she found him in his study, surrounded by ledgers and documents, his expression grim. "Forgive the intrusion," she said from the doorway. "I only wish to ask if you'll be joining us for dinner." Henry looked up, seeming almost surprised to find her there. After a moment's hesitation, he gestured her inside. "There's a matter I should perhaps discuss with you, as it affects Oakenhurst." Cautiously, Caroline entered, taking the chair he indicated opposite his desk. "There's been a failure at one of the banks where significant estate funds are held," he explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Not a complete collapse, but enough to create complications." "How serious are these complications?" Caroline asked directly. Henry seemed to appreciate her straightforward approach. "Not ruinous, but sufficient to require adjustments. Certain improvements we'd planned for the tenant farms may need to be postponed, the north wing renovations as well." Caroline considered this, then spoke carefully. "If I may, the household budget has a surplus from the economies I've implemented. Not a vast sum, but perhaps enough to proceed with at least the most essential improvements for the tenants." Henry stared at her, clearly not having expected this response. "You would redirect funds allocated for the Abbey. The Abbey has stood for centuries and will endure a delayed renovation," Caroline replied simply. "But families with leaking roofs and inadequate wells suffer immediately." For a long moment, Henry was silent, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Then, to her astonishment, a smile, small but genuine, curved his lips. "You continue to surprise me, Caroline," he said quietly. "When I agreed to this marriage, I expected a decorative mistress for Oakenhurst, perhaps an eventual mother for an heir. I did not anticipate a partner. The word hung between them, weighted with possibility. Caroline's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. Perhaps that is what a wife should be, she suggested. Not merely an ornament or a convenience, but a true helpmate. Perhaps, Henry agreed, still holding her gaze. I find the idea has considerable merit. That night, as Caroline prepared for bed, she found herself reflecting on the subtle transformation of her marriage over these winter months. From the cold, formal arrangement established on their wedding night, something else had begun to emerge. Not love, certainly, but a mutual respect, a cautious reaching toward connection. She thought of the invisible threads that had begun to weave between them, shared concerns for the estate, appreciation of each other's competence, small moments of unexpected understanding. Individually, each thread was fragile, easily broken, but together, they were beginning to form something that might, with time and care, become strong enough to bridge the distance between two solitary hearts. As she drifted toward sleep, Caroline allowed herself to hope, not for grand passion or dramatic declarations, but for the continued strengthening of those quiet threads, for the gradual awakening of the man whose name she bore but whose heart remained, for now, a chamber she had yet to enter. Outside her window, the first buds of spring swelled on bare branches, promise of renewal after the long winter's sleep. Spring arrived at Oakenhurst Abbey, with an explosion of colour that transformed the austere landscape. The gardens that Caroline had quietly reorganized during winter months now burst with carefully planned arrangements of daffodils, tulips, and hyacinths. The conservatory, repaired and rejuvenated after the storm damage, gleamed in the April sunshine. Caroline stood on the terrace, surveying her handiwork with quiet satisfaction, when Sophia joined her, linking their arms companionably. "You've worked wonders," Sophia observed. "I scarcely recognize the place." "Thank you," Caroline replied, her cheeks coloring slightly at the praise. Over the past months she had come to value Sophia's forthright friendship, a surprising alliance that had blossomed between them. "Henry noticed, you know," Sophia added casually. "I caught him walking the gardens yesterday at dawn, examining your plantings with the most curious expression." Caroline's heart quickened, but she kept her voice measured. "I'm pleased if the Duke approves of the improvements." Sophia sighed dramatically. Still so formal even when he isn't present to hear. "The Duke? As though you hadn't been married these 5 months." "6, Caroline corrected automatically, then bit her lip. "6, Sophia repeated, giving her a sidelong glance. "And still sleeping in separate chambers, I'd wager." "Sophia," Caroline gasped, scandalized. "Oh, come now, we're both women of the world. Besides," she added more gently, "I've eyes in my head. I've watched you these months. Watched him too." "And what exactly do you believe you've seen?" Caroline asked, unable to keep a note of vulnerability from her voice. Sophia turned to face her directly. "I've seen a woman quietly building a home around a man who doesn't know how to inhabit one anymore. And I've seen my brother watching that woman when he thinks no one notices, with confusion, with respect, and increasingly, I think, with longing." Caroline shook her head. "You're mistaken. He made his feelings quite clear on our wedding night." "Did he?" Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Henry has always been excellent at declaring what he believes to be true. Less adept at recognizing when those truths have changed." She squeezed Caroline's arm affectionately. "Just consider that the man who spoke those words to you 6 months ago is not the same man who worked beside you in the rain to save your precious plants." Before Caroline could formulate a response, a footman approached to announce the arrival of unexpected visitors, Lady Eleanor and Sir James Harrington, Caroline's parents. The reunion was joyful but tinged with concern, as Caroline immediately noted her father's gaunt appearance and laboured breathing. "It's nothing, my dear," Sir James insisted when they had a private moment. "A persistent winter chill, nothing more." But Lady Eleanor's worried glance told Caroline otherwise. Later, when the men had retired to discuss estate matters, Eleanor confided the truth. Sir James had suffered a serious bout of pneumonia, and the doctors had recommended a change of air. "We wouldn't impose," Eleanor assured her, "but your father was so determined to see you to ensure your happiness in this marriage." Caroline embraced her mother tightly. "You could never impose. This is your home, for as long as you need it." That evening, Henry surprised Caroline by suggesting they host a small dinner party to welcome her parents properly. "We might invite the Elliots and Judge Wilcox and his wife," he proposed. "People your parents would find congenial." His thoughtfulness touched her deeply. "That would be lovely, thank you." The Duke hesitated, then added, "I've observed that your father seems unwell. Is there anything that might be done?" The genuine concern in his voice emboldened Caroline. "Actually, yes, the physician recommended sea air. I wondered if perhaps when he's stronger, we might all journey to the Duke's coastal property that Mrs. Winters mentioned." "Seacliff House?" Henry looked surprised. "It hasn't been opened in years, but yes, that could be arranged. It would be good for Sir James, certainly." "Thank you," Caroline said simply, but her eyes conveyed a deeper gratitude. For a moment Henry seemed about to say more, but merely nodded and excused himself. The dinner party proved a greater success than anyone anticipated. Caroline, in her element as hostess, guided conversation skillfully, drawing out shy guests and diplomatically redirecting when topics became contentious. Henry, observing her from the head of the table, found himself increasingly captivated by this side of his wife, confident, gracious, intelligent, in a way that commanded respect without demanding attention. When Judge Wilcox steered the conversation toward local politics, territory where Caroline might reasonably have deferred to her husband, she instead offered insightful observations about the impact of proposed railway expansions on tenant farmers, a perspective that made the judge nod thoughtfully. "Your Duchess has a remarkable understanding of agricultural economics," the judge commented to Henry afterward. "Most ladies of my acquaintance concern themselves solely with household matters." "Caroline is not most ladies," Henry replied, surprising himself with the pride in his voice. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the household had retired, Henry found himself restless. Passing the library, he noticed a light still burning and entered to find Caroline curled in a window seat, a volume of poetry open on her lap. "You were magnificent this evening," he said, without preamble. Caroline looked up, startled. "I beg your pardon." "As hostess," he clarified, moving further into the room. "You handled everything perfectly. Mrs. Elliott's impropriety, the judge's political baiting, even Sophia's impertinent questions." A smile touched Caroline's lips. "Thank you. I enjoyed it, actually." "You seemed in your element," Henry observed, taking the chair opposite her. "Not at all like—" He stopped abruptly. "Not at all like the invisible girl you married," Caroline finished for him, her voice gentle rather than accusatory. Henry had the grace to look discomfited. "I have not been kind to you, Caroline." "You have been honest," she replied. "I've always valued honesty, even when it hurts." "Perhaps there are different kinds of truth," he said slowly. "The truth of what I believed when we married, and the truth of what I have come to know since." Caroline's heart began to race, but she kept her expression composed. "And what truth is that?" Henry seemed to struggle with his words, an unusual state for a man typically so assured. "That you are remarkable," he finally said. "That Oakenhurst has become a home again under your care. That my sister smiles more than she has in years. That when you enter a room, I find myself—" He trailed off, then stood abruptly. "Forgive me. It's late, and you must be tired after entertaining." "Henry?" Caroline called softly as he reached the door. He turned back, his expression guarded. "I was never invisible," she said. "Just unseen." Their gazes held for a long moment, before he nodded once and departed, leaving Caroline to wonder at the subtle shifting of their relationship, like the first tender shoots of spring emerging after a long winter. In the weeks that followed, Sir James's health improved noticeably, bolstered by the country air and Caroline's attentive care. Preparations began for the journey to Seacliff House, a flurry of activity that brought new energy to the Abbey. One afternoon, Caroline was reviewing inventories with Mrs. Winters when a commotion in the entrance hall drew their attention. They emerged to find Henry supporting a young boy of perhaps 12 years, the child's face pale with pain, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. "What happened?" Caroline asked, immediately moving to help. "He's one of the stable-master's sons," Henry explained, his voice tight with concern. "His horse spooked and threw him against the fence. I believe his leg is broken." Without hesitation, Caroline took charge, directing servants to prepare a room, sending for the doctor, and helping Henry settle the boy, Timothy, she learned, onto a settee while they waited. "You're at Oakenhurst Abbey now," she soothed the terrified child, distracting him from his pain with gentle questions about his favorite horses, while Henry looked on, something like wonder in his expression. The doctor confirmed a clean break that would heal well with proper care. When he suggested the boy be moved back to his family's cottage, Caroline intervened. "He'll stay here," she declared, "where we can ensure he receives proper care and rest." When the doctor seemed about to object, she added firmly, "I insist." Later, after Timothy had been settled in a comfortable guest room with his anxious parents reassured, Henry found Caroline in her sitting room, her normally immaculate appearance disheveled, a smudge of dirt on her cheek from where she had wiped away the boy's tears. "That was extraordinary," he said quietly. Caroline looked up wearily. "It was only right." "Not everyone would see it so," Henry replied, moving to sit beside her on the small sofa, closer than he had ever voluntarily positioned himself before. "Most women of your station would have sent the boy to the servants' quarters at best." "I am not most women," she echoed his words from the dinner party. "No," he agreed, his voice deepening. "You are certainly not." In a gesture that seemed almost unconscious, he reached out to brush the smudge from her cheek, his fingers lingering against her skin. Caroline held perfectly still, scarcely breathing as something electric passed between them. The moment stretched, taut with possibility, until the clock chimed the hour, startling them both. Henry withdrew his hand slowly, reluctantly. "I should let you rest," he said, rising. At the door he paused. "Caroline, thank you for bringing kindness back to Oakenhurst." As May turned to June, the planned journey to Seacliff House approached. The evening before their departure, Caroline was surprised to receive a small package delivered by Henry's valet. Inside lay an exquisite silver locket on a delicate chain. Opening it, she found a miniature painting of Oakenhurst Abbey on one side, and on the other, a tiny pressed flower, a forget-me-not from her conservatory. A note in Henry's precise handwriting accompanied it, "For the journey, and for making Oakenhurst worth remembering when we are away." Caroline pressed the locket to her heart, overcome with emotion. It was not a declaration of love, not quite, but it was acknowledgement, appreciation, a recognition that she was no longer unseen. The next morning, as their travelling carriage pulled away from Oakenhurst, Caroline caught Henry watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Sophia, seated opposite them, observed the exchange with barely concealed satisfaction. "I believe," Sophia murmured to Caroline when Henry was distracted by Sir James's question about the journey, "that Seacliff House may witness developments that Oakenhurst has only begun to imagine." Caroline's fingers strayed to the locket at her throat, and for the first time since her wedding night, she allowed herself to hope. Seacliff House stood like a sentinel at the edge of the world, its weathered stone facade commanding a breathtaking view of the restless sea below. Unlike the imposing grandeur of Oakenhurst Abbey, the coastal manor possessed a wild, romantic charm that immediately captivated Caroline. "It's magnificent," she breathed as their carriage wound up the cliff path. "My mother loved this place," Henry remarked, his eyes on the horizon. "She claimed the sea air cleared one's thoughts, and the isolation freed one's spirit." It was the first time he had voluntarily shared anything about his parents, and Caroline treasured the confidence, even as she noted how the mention of his mother softened his features. The house staff, hastily assembled from the village and neighboring estates, had done their best to prepare the long unused residence, but Caroline quickly discovered much remained to be done. Rather than expressing dismay, she embraced the challenge with characteristic determination. "We shall make it comfortable," she assured her father, who worried the primitive conditions might worsen his health rather than improve it. "My dear girl," Sir James replied fondly, "you have always possessed the remarkable ability to create sanctuary wherever you go." The first week passed in a flurry of activity, airing rooms, ordering provisions, establishing routines. Caroline found herself working alongside the hastily assembled staff, rather than merely directing them, rolling up her sleeves to scrub stubborn salt stains from windows and help the cook rescue ancient kitchen equipment from disuse. One evening, Henry discovered her in the disused library, balanced precariously on a ladder as she cleaned grime from book spines that had likely gone untouched for a decade. "Caroline!" he exclaimed, rushing forward as the ladder wobbled dangerously. "For heaven's sake, you'll break your neck." His hands found her waist, steadying her, and the sudden contact made them both freeze. Caroline looked down at him, acutely aware of his strong fingers splayed across her midriff, of the concern in his eyes that went beyond propriety into genuine fear for her safety. "I'm quite all right," she assured him, her voice not entirely steady, "just trying to salvage what books can be saved." Henry didn't immediately release her, even after she had descended the ladder. "You don't need to exhaust yourself," he said, his hands still at her waist. "We have servants for these tasks." "Too few, and none familiar with the house," she countered. "Besides, I find I enjoy the work. It's satisfying to bring order from chaos." "Is that what you've been doing at Oakenhurst as well?" he asked, his gaze intent. "Creating order from the chaos I allowed to develop?" Caroline hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Perhaps, though I would call it creating home, rather than merely order." Something flickered in Henry's eyes. Vulnerability, longing, she couldn't be certain. "And have you found home there?" "I'm beginning to," she answered softly. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken emotion, until voices in the corridor announced Sophia and Lady Eleanor's approach. Henry stepped back, releasing Caroline, but his eyes held hers a moment longer, communicating something she dared not yet interpret. The following days brought a new rhythm to their party. Mornings were devoted to Sir James's health regimen: sea air, gentle exercise, and the mineral waters a local physician had recommended. Afternoons often found the ladies exploring the village or the dramatic coastline, while evenings were spent in simple shared pleasures, reading aloud, music, conversation, unencumbered by the social constraints of London. In this informal setting, Caroline observed Henry gradually unbending. He laughed more freely at Sophia's outrageous stories, engaged in spirited chess matches with Sir James, and once memorably joined Caroline in a duet at the recently tuned pianoforte, his rich baritone complementing her modest soprano in a way that left her breathless. "You never mentioned you could sing," she commented afterward. "There has been little music at Oakenhurst for many years," he replied, a shadow crossing his features. "Since Elizabeth?" The name slipped out before Caroline could reconsider, and she immediately feared she had overstepped. Henry stiffened momentarily, then exhaled slowly. "Yes, she loved music. After she died, I couldn't bear to hear it." "I'm sorry," Caroline said softly, "for your loss and for raising painful memories." Henry studied her face, searching for something. "It was not your question that surprised me, but rather my reaction to it," he admitted. "The pain is different now, less immediate. I can speak of her without feeling as though my chest is being crushed. Time heals, they say," Caroline offered. "Time alone does not heal," Henry corrected her gently. "It merely distances. Other things heal: purpose, kindness, new connections." His eyes held hers. New beginnings. One evening, nearly 3 weeks into their stay, Henry suggested a picnic on a secluded beach, accessible only by a steep path from the cliffs. With Sir James feeling particularly energetic and the weather perfect, the entire party agreed enthusiastically. The descent proved challenging but worthwhile, revealing a perfect crescent of golden sand, embraced by towering cliffs, the sea before them a dazzling sapphire. Servants laid out blankets and an elaborate luncheon, while Timothy, now using only a single crutch, delightedly collected shells at the water's edge under Sophia's indulgent supervision. After they had eaten, Sir James dozed peacefully in the shade of a parasol, Lady Eleanor beside him with her embroidery. Sophia announced her intention to teach Timothy the finer points of skipping stones, leading the boy farther down the beach. "They're not being remotely subtle," Caroline observed with amusement as their companions deliberately created distance. "Sophia has many admirable qualities," Henry replied, drawing Caroline to her feet. "But subtlety has never been among them. Walk with me." They strolled along the water's edge, shoes in hand, the cool waves occasionally lapping at their bare feet. When they reached a natural sea cave carved into the cliff face, Henry guided Caroline inside, where the roar of the ocean echoed mysteriously against ancient stone. "I brought something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Something that should have been yours from the beginning." He withdrew a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a magnificent ring, an oval sapphire surrounded by diamonds, set in intricate gold filigree. "The Ashworth betrothal ring," he explained. "It has belonged to the Duchess of Ashworth for 7 generations. I couldn't give it to you when we married. It felt like a betrayal of what it symbolized. A love match, a true union of hearts." Caroline's breath caught as Henry took her left hand, where a simple gold band already rested. "Caroline Harrington Ashworth," he said solemnly, "I married you in name and law 6 months ago, but today I ask you to marry me in heart and soul. Will you accept this ring as a symbol not of duty or arrangement, but of my deepest love and devotion?" Tears spilled freely down Caroline's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "1,000 times, yes." Henry slipped the ring onto her finger alongside her wedding band, then drew her into his arms. "I'm saying that somewhere between your kindness to a fallen stable boy and your laughter with my impossible sister, I have fallen in love with you, Caroline." The words hung in the salt-laden air between them, momentous and fragile. Caroline felt tears spring to her eyes. Years of feeling unseen, unwanted, invisible, suddenly washed away by this declaration. "I don't deserve your love," Henry continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Not after how I've treated you. But if you could find it in your heart to forgive me, to allow me to court you properly, not as the Duke courting a suitable match, but as a man who admires and cherishes everything about the woman who has become his wife in name only—" "Henry," Caroline interrupted, her voice trembling as she placed her free hand against his cheek. "I have loved you since the night we saved the conservatory together, perhaps even before, in ways I didn't yet understand." His eyes searched hers, wonder and disbelief mingling in their grey depths. "How can you have loved me when I gave you no reason, no encouragement?" "Love doesn't always require reason," she answered simply. "Sometimes it simply grows, like those neglected plants in the conservatory, quiet and persistent, requiring only the smallest glimmer of light to flourish." Slowly, reverently, Henry leaned forward until their foreheads touched. "May I kiss you, Caroline? Not as duty, not as arrangement, but as a husband who loves his wife with all his heart." In answer, Caroline closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his, in a kiss that spoke of months of longing, of hopes she had scarcely allowed herself to nurture, of a future suddenly radiant with possibility. When they finally parted from their kiss in the sea cave, the sunset had begun to paint the sky in spectacular hues of gold and crimson. Henry drew Caroline close against him, her head resting naturally in the hollow beneath his chin, his arms encircling her with a protectiveness that spoke of newfound treasures. "We should return to the others," Caroline murmured eventually, though she made no move to leave the sanctuary of his embrace. "They'll wonder where we've gone." Henry chuckled, the sound reverberating pleasantly against her cheek. "I suspect Sophia, at least, will have a fairly accurate idea." "She's been rather transparent in her matchmaking efforts," Caroline agreed with a soft laugh. "My sister lacks subtlety, but possesses remarkable insight," Henry replied, gently tucking a strand of Caroline's wind-blown hair behind her ear. "She saw what I was too blind to recognize, that the arrangement I so coldly established was becoming the greatest blessing of my life." They walked back hand in hand, no longer caring if their linked fingers might raise eyebrows. As they approached the main path, they saw Sophia standing alone, clearly waiting for them. Her knowing smile broadened at the sight of their clasped hands and the new ring glittering alongside Caroline's wedding band. "Well," she drawled, "it appears Seacliff House has worked its magic more quickly than even I anticipated." Henry laughed, a free and joyous sound that Caroline had never heard from him before. "You are insufferable, sister." "And you," Sophia retorted, her eyes soft despite her teasing tone, "are finally yourself again." She turned to Caroline, genuine affection in her gaze. "Thank you for giving us back the real Henry. I had quite despaired of ever seeing him again." That evening, as the family gathered in Seacliff's cozy drawing room, Henry surprised everyone by making an announcement. "Caroline and I have decided to renew our vows," he declared, his hand covering his wife's, the sapphire glinting in the candlelight. "A small private ceremony here at Seacliff, where our hearts truly found each other." Lady Eleanor's eyes filled with happy tears as she embraced her daughter. "Nothing could give me greater joy than to see you truly loved," she whispered. Sir James, looking healthier than he had in months, clasped Henry's hand firmly. "That you have a treasure in my daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I trust you now recognize her worth." "More than I can express," Henry replied with quiet sincerity. I propose a celebration afterward, Sophia added eagerly. Nothing elaborate. Simply good food, music, perhaps dancing on the terrace overlooking the sea. And where will you find appropriate musicians in this remote location, dear sister? Henry inquired with fond exasperation. Leave that to me, Sophia replied mysteriously. I have resources you cannot imagine. The following days were filled with gentle preparations for the ceremony. Caroline, freed from the weight of uncertainty that had burdened her for months, moved through Seacliff House with a lightness of spirit that transformed her. Her natural beauty, always present but subdued by her habitual reserve, now shone with an inner radiance that caught Henry's breath whenever she entered a room. For his part, Henry seemed a man awakened from a long slumber. The cold formality that had been his armor for years gradually fell away, revealing the man Sophia had insisted still existed beneath, thoughtful, occasionally playful, capable of deep feeling beneath his controlled exterior. One evening Caroline found him in the library, studying a small portrait miniature she had never seen before. "Elizabeth?" she asked softly, recognizing the moment called for neither jealousy nor retreat. Henry nodded, then held out his hand to draw her beside him on the window seat. "I've carried this for 9 years," he said, his voice steady as he showed her the portrait of a pretty, vivacious-looking young woman with laughing eyes. "Not out of any romantic notion that I would forever mourn her, but because I feared forgetting her face." Caroline studied the miniature with gentle respect. She was beautiful. She was, Henry agreed, full of life and laughter. We grew up together, and loving her seemed as natural as breathing. He carefully closed the miniature's case. When she died, I convinced myself that I had experienced my one allotment of love in this life, and that duty alone would sustain me thereafter. He set the miniature aside and took both of Caroline's hands in his. "I was wrong, Caroline. So terribly wrong. What I feel for you, it's different from what I felt for Elizabeth, but no less profound. Perhaps even deeper, because it has grown from respect and admiration rather than childhood affection." Caroline's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I never dared hope for this," she confessed. "After our wedding night, I thought perhaps in time we might achieve a comfortable companionship, but never this." "I have much to atone for," Henry said, raising her hands to his lips. "Words spoken that cannot be unsaid, months of coldness you did not deserve. Will you allow me a lifetime to make amends?" "There is nothing to forgive," Caroline replied softly. "We begin anew, here and now." The next morning, Henry surprised her by suggesting they visit the village together. As they walked through the small fishing community, Caroline noted with pleasure how different his manner was from the formal, distant nobility he typically displayed at Oakenhurst. Here he greeted fishermen by name, inquired after families, stopped to admire a child's shell collection with genuine interest. "You know these people well," she observed, as they paused to purchase fresh bread from the village bakery. "My mother brought us here every summer," Henry explained, nodding to the elderly baker. "She believed aristocracy meant responsibility toward those under our care, not just privilege. These families have fished Ashworth waters for generations. Their welfare is bound to ours." "A wise perspective," Caroline replied, understanding better now the complex man she had married, formed by loss, yes, but also by principles worth honoring. As they walked back along the cliff path, the sea breeze tugging at Caroline's bonnet, Henry spoke of his hopes for their future. "I've been considering changes at Oakenhurst," he said. "The tenant cottages on the north side need complete rebuilding, not just repairs, and the village school requires expansion." "Ambitious projects," Caroline noted with approval. "Too long delayed," Henry admitted. "I've managed Oakenhurst efficiently, but without true vision. Your perspective has shown me how much more might be accomplished." He paused, gazing out over the restless sea. "I've also been thinking about heirs." Caroline's heart skipped a beat. This was territory they had not yet discussed since their reconciliation. "I've been a duke without a duchess in more than name," Henry continued carefully. "And while Oakenhurst needs an heir, I find I'm more concerned with being a husband and perhaps someday a father, not for the sake of the title but for the family we might create together." The simple sincerity of his words moved Caroline deeply. "I would like that very much," she replied softly. True to her word, Sophia arranged for a string quartet from a neighboring estate to play for the celebration following the renewal ceremony. The ceremony itself took place at sunset on the cliffside terrace, with only family as witnesses and a local vicar officiating. Caroline wore a simple gown of pale blue silk, not the formal wedding dress of their first ceremony, but something chosen with joy rather than obligation. Henry, watching her approach across the terrace with wildflowers in her hair and happiness illuminating her face, felt his heart swell with emotions he had denied himself for too long. The vows they exchanged were not the formal, traditional words of their first wedding, but promises written from the heart, speaking of second chances, of seeing and being seen, of love that grows from respect and kindness. "Caroline," Henry said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I pledge to you not just my name, my protection, or my honor, though these are yours without question. I pledge to you my heart, fully and without reservation. I promise to see you, truly see you, every day of our lives together. I promise to cherish your gentle strength, your quiet wisdom, your compassionate spirit. You have brought light back into my world, and I will spend my life ensuring you never again feel invisible or unvalued." Tears slipped down Caroline's cheeks as she responded in kind. "Henry, I pledge to you my heart, my faith, and my abiding love. I promise to stand beside you in all seasons, to create home wherever we may be, to remind you always that life offers more than duty. You have given me the greatest gift, the knowledge that I am truly seen and valued. I will spend my life helping you remember how to live with an open heart." As the vicar pronounced them once more husband and wife, Henry drew Caroline into an embrace that erased all memory of the perfunctory kiss they had shared at their first wedding. This was no sealed contract, but a promise embodied, witnessed by those they loved and blessed by the glorious sunset sky above. The celebration that followed was exactly as Sophia had envisioned, intimate yet joyous, elegant yet relaxed. Sir James, his health remarkably improved, managed to dance one careful quadrille with his daughter before ceding her to her husband. As Henry led Caroline in a waltz, their movements perfectly synchronized despite having never danced together before, he murmured in her ear, "Do you remember what I said to you on our wedding night?" Caroline tensed slightly, the painful memory still capable of stinging despite all that had changed. "I do. I was a fool," Henry said firmly. "A blind, heartless fool. Tonight I say the opposite. I love you beyond measure, Caroline. My desire for you consumes me. This is not an arrangement. It is the greatest blessing of my life." Caroline's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she gazed up at the man who had become everything to her. "And I love you, Henry Ashworth, with all that I am, all that I ever will be." Later, when the music had ended and their guests had retired, Henry and Caroline stood alone on the terrace, watching moonlight dance across the restless sea. For the first time since their arrival at Seacliff House, they would not bid each other good night at separate doors. "Are you nervous?" Henry asked gently, his arms encircling her from behind. Caroline leaned back against his solid strength. "A little," she admitted, "but not afraid. Never afraid when I'm with you." Henry turned her in his arms, his expression solemn in the moonlight. "I make you this vow, Caroline, beyond what we spoke today. You will never again be invisible. Not to me, not to anyone who matters. I will spend every day of our lives ensuring you know how deeply you are seen, how completely you are loved." In the master bedroom of Seacliff House, with the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below and starlight streaming through the windows, husband and wife truly became one, not in dutiful obligation, but in passionate, tender love that had been worth every moment of waiting, every heartache of uncertainty. As summer reached its zenith, the party prepared to return to Oakenhurst Abbey. Sir James and Lady Eleanor would remain at Seacliff House until autumn, the sea air having proved so beneficial to his recovery. Sophia, declaring herself utterly exhausted by so much romantic sentiment, announced her intention to visit friends in Bath before returning to London for the little season. "You two lovebirds hardly need a chaperone now," she teased as the carriage was loaded for departure. "Besides, Oakenhurst deserves to meet its new Duchess properly, the real Caroline, not the shadow who arrived 6 months ago." Caroline embraced her sister-in-law warmly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing what might be possible when I had lost hope." "Nonsense," Sophia replied, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. "You would have melted his frozen heart eventually. I merely accelerated the inevitable." The journey back to Oakenhurst felt entirely different from their departure. No longer a duke and his convenient bride, but partners in the truest sense. They spoke of plans for the estate, of improvements to tenant conditions, of making the Abbey a true home and centre of the community, as it had been in generations past. "We might host a harvest festival," Caroline suggested, as the familiar countryside rolled past their carriage windows. "Invite all the tenant families, the villagers. Revive the old traditions your grandmother mentioned." "An excellent idea," Henry agreed, his hand resting comfortably on hers. "And perhaps we should consider opening the West Wing for visiting artists and scholars, as my mother once did. Oakenhurst was known as a centre of culture and learning in her day." Caroline's eyes lit up at the prospect. "I should like that very much. The Abbey has such history. It deserves to be a living legacy, not a mausoleum." When Oakenhurst finally came into view, its Gothic towers silhouetted against the summer sky, Caroline felt a surge of affection for the great house that had initially seemed so forbidding. It was home now, truly home, not merely a residence where she performed duties. The staff, lined up to greet them as protocol demanded, couldn't help but notice the transformation in their master and mistress. The Duke, typically so reserved and formal, helped his wife from the carriage himself rather than waiting for a footman, his hand lingering at her waist. The Duchess, always gracious but previously subdued, positively glowed as she greeted each servant by name, her smile reaching her eyes in a way it never had before. "I do believe they're in love," the housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, remarked to the butler later that evening, her tone suggesting she found this development both surprising and not entirely proper. "About time, if you ask me," the butler replied with uncharacteristic sentiment. "The Abbey's been a gloomy place these 9 years. A bit of happiness won't go amiss." That night, as Caroline prepared for bed in what had been her solitary chamber, Henry appeared at the connecting door that had remained firmly closed since their wedding night. "I've had the master suite prepared for us," he said, a question in his eyes. "But if you prefer your own space—" Caroline crossed the room and placed her fingers gently against his lips. "I have had quite enough of separate chambers to last a lifetime," she said softly. "Take me to our room, husband." The months that followed brought changes to Oakenhurst that few would have predicted. Under the joint guidance of the Duke and Duchess, the estate flourished not merely as a financial enterprise, but as a living community. The tenant cottages were rebuilt to modern standards, the village school expanded, the harvest festival revived with such success that it became the talk of the county. Within the Abbey itself, the West Wing was renovated to accommodate visiting artists and scholars, bringing new energy and ideas to the ancient halls. The conservatory, now bursting with exotic blooms year-round, became a place of study for botanical enthusiasts from across England. Most significant, however, was the change in the Duke himself. The cold, remote nobleman who had held the world at arm's length for nearly a decade, gradually transformed into a respected leader, a generous patron, and, to those who knew him well, a man capable of great tenderness. In early spring, nearly a year after their journey to Seacliff House, Caroline shared news that completed their joy. She was expecting their first child. Henry's reaction, dropping to his knees before her chair, pressing his face against her still flat stomach, whispering words of wonder and gratitude, erased any lingering doubt that their marriage had transcended its pragmatic beginnings to become something neither could have imagined on that rainy wedding day. "Are you pleased?" Caroline asked, running her fingers through his hair as he knelt before her. Henry looked up, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Beyond measure," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I never thought to know such happiness, Caroline. Never believed myself worthy of it after how I treated you. The past is behind us," she said gently. "We look only forward now." Throughout her pregnancy, Henry proved himself the most attentive of husbands, balancing protective concern with respect for Caroline's capable nature. When she insisted on continuing her work with the tenant families until the final weeks, he accompanied her rather than forbidding the activity, recognizing that her sense of purpose was as vital to her well-being as physical rest. Jane, ever faithful and discreet, had remained by Caroline's side throughout her pregnancy, assisting with the baby's layette, overseeing the new nursery, and offering quiet reassurances on sleepless nights. Her presence had become more than that of a lady's maid. It was the steady hand of friendship in a time of tender anticipation. In early summer, as Caroline's time approached, Lady Eleanor arrived at Oakenhurst to support her daughter, bringing the bittersweet news that Sir James had peacefully passed away in his sleep at Seacliff House, having lived to see his daughter truly happy and secure in her marriage. His last words were of you, Eleanor told Caroline as they sat in the nursery that had been prepared for the coming child. He said, "Our Caroline found her way home after all." I believe he meant not just to Oakenhurst, but to true love. Caroline wept in her mother's arms, grieving her father's loss, yet grateful he had lived to witness her happiness. Henry, finding them thus, enfolded both women in his embrace, offering the strength and tenderness that had become his true nature. In late June, just as the roses in the gardens reached their peak, Lady Eleanor Grace Ashworth entered the world after a difficult but ultimately successful labour. Henry, breaking with aristocratic tradition, had refused to leave his wife's side throughout the ordeal, his face the first Caroline saw when she awakened from exhaustion to find their daughter nestled against her breast. "She has your eyes," he whispered, his finger gently tracing the perfect curve of their daughter's cheek. "And I suspect, your quiet strength. Perhaps she'll have your determined spirit," Caroline replied with a tired smile. "Heaven help us if she inherits both." As summer turned to autumn, the small family settled into new rhythms. Caroline recovered her strength gradually, assisted by Lady Eleanor, who had taken up permanent residence in the East Wing. Henry adjusted his duties to spend time each day with his wife and daughter, often found in the nursery at odd hours, simply watching little Eleanor sleep, marvelling at the miracle they had created together. With her work at Oakenhurst evidently complete, and the Duke once more a man who smiled, Sophia announced her departure with theatrical flair. She would travel to Bath, she said, to restore chaos where order has grown dull, and perhaps scandalize a few retired colonels along the way. Before leaving, she pressed a kiss to her niece's tiny brow and whispered to Caroline, "You've done the impossible, my dear. You've made Henry human again. I shall return for the christening, of course." On the anniversary of their renewed vows, Henry led Caroline to the conservatory, now transformed into an exotic paradise of blooms and greenery, a testament to her patient care. In the center, he had arranged a small table for an intimate dinner, surrounded by the plants that had first brought them together during that stormy night. "Do you remember?" he asked as they sat amid the lush foliage, the rich scents of tropical flowers surrounding them. "How could I forget?" Caroline replied, reaching across the table to take his hand. "It was the first time I saw beyond the Duke to the man, and the first time I truly saw you," Henry acknowledged, raising her hand to his lips. Not as the convenient bride, the efficient mistress of Oakenhurst, but as Caroline, brave, compassionate, determined to save what others had neglected. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package. Inside lay a delicate gold bracelet, adorned with tiny enameled flowers matching those in the conservatory. "For the woman who taught me that growth requires patience," he said as he fastened it around her wrist. "That neglected hearts, like neglected plants, can flourish again with proper care." Caroline gazed at the exquisite workmanship, then at the man who had traveled so far from the cold, remote figure she had married. "I love you, Henry Ashworth," she said simply, "more with each passing day." "And I love you, my Caroline," he replied, his voice rich with emotion. The woman who was never truly invisible, merely waiting for the right eyes to see her. As they shared a kiss amid the blooms that symbolized their journey, Caroline reflected on the strange path that had brought them here. From a pragmatic arrangement spoken in cold honesty to a love so deep it had transformed not just their lives, but the world around them. For Henry, who had locked away his heart behind walls of duty and reserve, there was profound peace in the knowledge that love, when freely given and gratefully received, was not weakness, but the greatest strength of all. And for Caroline, who had once believed herself destined to remain unseen, there was exquisite joy in being so completely known, so deeply cherished by the man who had once whispered words of rejection, but now spoke only of love, desire, and gratitude for the arrangement that had brought them together, and the courage that had transformed it into something precious beyond measure. The end. Dear listener, perhaps tonight as you sit quietly with your memories or lie beneath the hush of twilight, you find yourself thinking of all the seasons your heart has weathered, the quiet winters of waiting, the uncertain springs of change, the summers of love lost or found, and the autumns of letting go. This story of Caroline and the Duke is not only a tale of love that blooms unexpectedly, it's a reminder that even the coldest heart can learn to feel again, and that no one, no matter how overlooked or unseen, is ever truly forgotten by life. Just like the neglected orchids in Caroline's conservatory, you too carry strength within you, soft, steady, and resilient. And even if the world around you has gone quiet, your spirit still blossoms in ways that matter deeply. You are not invisible. You are not past your prime. You are still becoming, still capable of bringing beauty, warmth, and wisdom into the lives around you. So tonight, let your soul rest easy. Let go of any heaviness you carry. Let your heart be reminded that love, respect, and recognition can arrive in the most unexpected chapters. And sometimes our most beautiful seasons come later in life. You are cherished. You are protected. You are not alone. Sleep peacefully, dear one. Tomorrow holds gentle promises. And remember, the courage it takes to love again, to trust again, to begin again, is the quietest kind of strength. With all our gratitude, Legends of the Fall Team. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We hope this story brought you comfort, inspiration, and a gentle reminder that even in silence, love can find its voice. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share this video to help support our channel. Truly, from the bottom of our hearts. Your support is what keeps us motivated to keep telling more stories filled with emotion, healing, second chances, and unforgettable love. At the end of this video, another one of our moving stories will appear. Click it and be surprised by another tale as emotional and powerful as this one.